We're going to learn about the triangular trade, and we're going to look a little bit more into the Atlantic slave trade, though we've already touched on it a bit. Okay, so the Atlantic slave trade. You've already heard about the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was started in the 1500s to fill the need for labor in Spain's American Empire. Okay, now, you've seen several videos about how the traders shipped tens of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to work on tobacco and sugar plantations in the Americas. They also worked on other plantations as well, but we'll get into that some other time. Plantations are large farms that are more like factory farms. You have a lot of people working together to grow one type of product, and they're mass producing that product. The Atlantic slave trade formed one part of a three-legged trade network known as the triangular trade. As you can see here, the triangular trade did not just start or stop in one particular area, but it was primarily about trade between three different continents: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Okay, so usually you would have people starting off from Europe, traveling to Africa, getting slaves, and taking the slaves to America. And then whatever was produced in the Americas was taken back to Europe. So here's a more simplified example of the triangular trade. You have Europe sending finished goods, factory-made products, to Africa and the Americas. Things like pottery, shoes, guns, ammunition, things of that nature that Africa and the Americas could not produce on their own. And Africa would send to Europe ivory and slaves. They would also send slaves and gold to the Americas. Now, the Americas sent their products such as molasses, cotton, tobacco, and rum to Europe. And they would also send tobacco and rum to the African nations. So this was a triangular trade that really, I would have to say, harmed the African continent more than anything else. And that is primarily due to the loss of human workers and people of kingdoms in that nation. So the African slave trade, or I should say the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans relied on African rulers and traders to seize captives in the interior and bring them to the coastal trade posts and fortresses. This started many wars in Africa, as many African kingdoms would attack others in order to capture slaves. The slave trade intensified as the demand for slaves increased, and Americans in the Americas and the demand for luxury goods increased in Africa. If you wanted more guns, you had to go find more slaves. In order to find more slaves, you had to get more guns. It was this continuous cycle that impacted the African nations. Okay, so the destinations of the enslaved Africans. What country imported the most slaves? And which country imported the fewest? Well, let's take a moment and look at this pie chart. You will see many pie charts, especially on your in-course test. The Portuguese imported about 37%. This went to the nation that we now know as Brazil. The Caribbean islands imported the most, being 41%. And this is the area in which the labor was the harshest, and the death rate was very high for African slaves. Spanish America, including the Spanish Caribbean, was 15%. Europe and Asia was 2.5%, and British North America was 4.5%. The Middle Passage. This was by far one of the harshest parts of the triangular trade, or the African slave trade. Hundreds of men, women, and children were crammed into one vessel. These vessels were often referred to as floating coffins, as many died from disease or mistreatment. You were packed so tightly that they could not move. Few of the Africans who resisted lived to see the end of their journey. In order to in order to give a demonstration to other African slaves on the ship, those who misbehaved were usually killed in front of other slaves or immediately thrown over the ship. That being said, if the ship encountered harsh weather or the boat started running low on water or food, the people in charge of the ship, the captain and crew, would take the slaves and simply throw them overboard in order to lighten the load of the ship. It was a very harsh time. The impact of the slave trade. By the 1800s, an estimated 11 million enslaved Africans had reached the Americas. Another 2 million probably died during the Middle Passage. That's incredible. The slave trade caused the decline of some African states. The loss of countless numbers of young women and men resulted in some small African states disappearing forever. New African states arose, whose way of life depended on the slave trade. The rulers of these new states waged war against other Africans in order to gain control of the slave trade in their region. Take a look at this map. This map shows the difference in less than 100 years, about 33 years in the African continent. Between 1880 and 1913, look at the change of the borders in the African state. On the African continent.